So I'm sure some of you have noticed the somewhat counterintuitive fact that many of the most brilliant and truly insightful people do not necessarily hold a degree in the area or subjects that they know about, let alone having a PhD to quote unquote prove it. And conversely, it's often quite unfortunate that someone's training for a higher degree can often or leaves them disappointingly blind in nuances or in other areas. And in many cases, I would say academia fosters relationships of what I would call intellectual codependency. This can be very damaging on an individual's own sense of self trust in their ability to use or extend their knowledge. And we might also think about intellectual codependency as the shadow side of the whole peer review paradigm. So in this video, I want to start in on the deconstruction of our social notion of expertise, which is a concept long overdue for a reality check and for greater specification and qualifications. So the ultimate aim here with this specific conversation is that I want to help you foster or regain your own trust in your own ability to identify and make valid inferences. For example, to trust your own capacity for understanding. And everything that I'm about to say here, and in general, I will always have this view, is none of this is anti-expertise. None of this is anti-science. None of this is even anti-higher education. If you know me, you can watch my other videos. It's pretty clear. What I'm talking about here is more of a call for greater nuance and discernment in how we're making certain evaluations of expertise. Okay, with all of that being said, because I know that on this topic, there's a lot of ways that someone might misunderstand something. So first things first, this is just a sketch. And to begin with, I would always, when you're doing this type of analysis, just start right in on where the obvious contradictions are. Because sometimes these kinds of contradictions are just phenomena that need to be resolved at a higher conceptual level. They appear as contradictions because you're not yet on the most accurate level for perceiving, for example, what the root phenomenon might be. And so if all you have are its effects, then they might actually look like they don't pertain to each other, or they might actually look directly contradictory because you're in the wrong context for it. But sometimes these contradictions can also be a sign of something else. They can be what I call, my metaphor here is like a shadow of a power structure that is actually blocking the expression of truth. So this is very abstract, so I know I have to break that down. What I want to do here is just to super quickly go over a list of 10 places where, for lack of a better way to put this again, the natural flow or expression or dissemination, I don't even like that metaphor, of knowledge has been distorted or diverted or occluded in some way that services the maintenance of power rather than or in such a way that this power structure is not always in service of the open sharing or open expression of truth. So this might still sound a little bit abstract, but just bear with me. I'm trying to explain this on a super foundational level right now because it's really widespread and it's central to the ways that the status quo right now never really makes any progress, because we haven't yet really analyzed this concept of how we are appealing to and evaluating and conferring expertise as a concept. Okay, so really quickly, because all of these are really their own topic and demand their own analysis and essay, really. But number one, there are authentic and inauthentic modes or forms of expertise. Not everyone who is socially conferred as an expert necessarily embodies that authentically. It's just true. Now, number two, there are all kinds of people with deep and authentic expertise, expert knowledge, who are not recognized as such because of existing biases and social blind spots. And that's also just another fact. So already we have like a super inaccurate distribution of the way that we're even applying the concept of expertise. It's not accurate. Number three, the historical conditions that demanded and required the standardization of criteria for recognizing expertise, for recognizing certain people as experts of such and such, these conditions have greatly shifted. So we no longer actually have many of some of those problems that existed, for example, in the early modern period or the Renaissance period or even like the early industrial period, and these key moments when certain forms of professionalization and standardization like really took hold. A lot of those conditions have been resolved, and now we're actually in some cases facing the opposite extremes of some of those issues. The axis of distribution for needing to properly evaluate expertise or reliable knowledge has shifted. Okay, number four, the barriers to education and the dissemination of information, as we know, has almost completely flattened out. So access to the latest research or skills or understanding available in almost all fields of study is now possible, which means that such expertise within that context can be legitimately shared amongst the population. So this is good because it raises the baseline, but it also does raise the bar of what is considered truly specialized knowledge and why. Number five, taking the highest collective view is the overvaluation of the amount or contents of knowledge. Is that what we should continue to recognize in an era when much of this factual and analytical layers of knowledge are reproduced so easily within various configurations of LLMs or other AI-based assistants? Those levels, the easily reproducible levels, they need, because if, especially if they're within any type of like artificially intelligent system, they need their own forms of verification at this point. And then to say nothing about the recursivity of, you know, experts relying on those for citations and research. So that's a topic. And then number six, one can imagine the construct of expertise dissolving or morphing into ones that place more of a focus on, for example, how good of a practitioner you are in the sense of being an embodiment of your expertise. So not just like a traditional sense of, you know, I'm a practitioner of such and such modality, but and for all types of knowledge, all types of expertise, like how well are you embodying that? Is someone's embodied expertise, is it based upon their capacity for holistic vision, intuition, and compassion? At this point, like, who is interested in expertise that comes from a place that isn't even on that level? Or do you really want, like, do you really want your advice from a physician, for example, to come from someone who is actually in like a toxic relationship with their own family or has other issues going on? Like, in the old paradigm, we used to like separate those kinds of things out because like knowledge was just like so clearly bounded, and it was all about, it's all this like kind of a false objectivity paradigm. But actually these things are linked. So like these things will condition how you interpret new information, they condition how you communicate. These are not separate issues, it's all linked through energy. Okay, and number seven, what this all points to is how much individual authenticity and empowerment have literally been handed over historically in the name of someone else's knowledge. Now, there's limited cases in which we do need to rely on that type of structure. And there are empowering and honest ways of sharing knowledge. And for example, teaching is one of them, if it also hasn't fallen into a paradigm of ultimately disempowering others by actively cultivating, in many cases, distrust of their own thought processes, for example. We assume it would all be empowering, it should be empowering, but it's not. In many educational structures, it's just actively disempowering. And then number 8, one of my favorite ones here, there are internal contradictions within the social life of expertise that show the places where it's actually more about maintaining power, as I've said, rather than cultivating or openly sharing truth, the open expression of truth, which just cares about free exchange. And the conferral of expertise can actually be abused within this context. So, for example, and I'm not giving my agreement with this. It still needs to be qualified, but this is just an example. So someone with a PhD in neuroscience, for example, is invited to speak as a guest on someone's podcast. And they end up being asked about a lot of other topics, some adjacent and some not really adjacent at all. But it's all under the influence of the perception of, on the part of the listeners in the audience, of their expertise, which was grounded in their neuroscience research. Now, hold on, because I'm not saying this in the way it's going to seem like on the surface. I'm using that as an example. The next point is that, meanwhile, that same scholar might turn around and admonish so-called non-experts for talking about the very obvious public facts from current neuroscience research because they're not experts. And also, even within their own department or program or institution, there are conditions on which areas of knowledge someone is allowed to draw upon and still be considered a serious scholar of that field. And the point here with all of this is just how arbitrary these divisions are, how socially constructed they are, which means how dependent they are on social biases. And that's not the foundation on which we want to have a really solid understanding of what we want to consider expertise and how we want to evaluate that very concept, how we want to evaluate the reliability of a given source of knowledge. Since our whole paradigms have changed since then, there are other sources of knowledge. And this is what I mean by going back to earlier extremes. It has swung the other way now. This is a whole side topic. That's why this is just a sketch. So my final point here, number 10, is that authentic knowledge is integrated and it's holistic. So by definition, any form of knowledge that is derived from socially constructed forms of separation will be necessarily incomplete at best, but it's also unstable. And as one friend put it to me, for example, if he didn't share what he knew about XYZ, for example, and how that impacts the findings of a given discipline or the area that you're working on, if you know about that and it has consequences and you arbitrarily don't discuss that, for example, that's actually considered or can be considered a case of academic dishonesty. Or even without being in an academic context, it's a question about integrity. And at best, it's a form of artifice. So as long as we're recognizing that, right? We need to recognize that. So you can see how this is already a very tangled type of topic. So I would love to hear your interpretations or how you're hearing what I'm saying in the comments. If it seems like I've left something out, if it seems like I'm missing out on something, let me know, because I do care about self-correcting if I have actually overlooked something. But this is actually a tangled topic, and so far this is really only a sketch. So that's the spirit in which I'm putting this out there. But it is important to really start digging into this, because number one, I think I've already hinted at this, but in most cases at this point, I think that specialization has actually gone too far. You can only go so far with blinders on and not paying attention to these obvious points of consequence with adjacent areas. And I'm not even talking about like our traditional notions of like interdisciplinary, like this is way beyond that. Like I'm talking about deep integration. So, I mean, unless you're like a brain surgeon or you're like an aerospace technician, like areas where that level of specialization is obviously needed, specialization is valid for as long as like a given area of knowledge is still forming and differentiating and producing differences that make a difference. And then the second part here, or the converse of that statement actually, is that now there's like the real progress now is to be found in synthesis and integration. And this goes beyond the mental level. This is beyond the idea of like fields and disciplines and topics. Okay, this is about integrating knowledge on the physical, emotional, and spiritual levels as well. Deep integration. And this is really where we should place social value and the conferral of like authentic modes of knowing, authentically rooted forms of knowledge. So who is doing this work of integrating and embodying their knowledge? Who's remaining disembodied within the very narrow confines of the worldview that's kind of like a secondhand worldview, really, of the biases of a given discipline and field of study? So wake up call, like huge biases exist, right? And these do have toxic and damaging consequences when someone is kind of like coerced into a very, very specific line of inquiry, and the rest of their knowledge is not welcome, or it's really kind of a form of gaslighting, actually. So the point of this all comes down to is, you know, take responsibility for your own integration of knowledge. Like this is beyond the academic context. I'm not talking to academics here. This is for everyone, because this integration is what's not being cultivated right now, like anywhere. And we could argue that such integration is actually still actively suppressed in many contexts. So, in sum, the dominant forms of what is recognized as expertise today, number one, is not necessarily authentic. It is not necessarily rooted in authentic, embodied forms of that knowledge, because in many cases it can't be because of how separated, artificially separated it is from other areas. And number two, they're definitely not integrated, as I just said, because often the individuals themselves who, you know, carry these forms of expertise are not integrated, like they haven't done that work, or they are actively kept from doing it. And so that's really like the way I would summarize the situation here on this level of analysis. So I hope this makes some sense. I hope this resonates with many of you. Don't apologize or feel shame or feel shy about the places in your life where you are doing the work of integration, because it does go against the grain. It goes actively against the grain of the matrix, which is all about analysis in the service of fragmentation. So integration is where it's at. This will be the foundation of authentic expertise going forward. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts, your objections, your reactions to this in the comments as usual. And if you'd like an easy way to help support my work, help support this channel, just take a moment and dive into one of my previous videos, ones you haven't watched yet. I would really appreciate that. So thanks again, and I will see you in the next one.